I've said this before, but the Germans did not have very good logistics in World War II, and is probably the reason why they lost at Barbarossa and on the Eastern Front in general. So let's get into it. Todd has asked, "Good evening, sir. As a retired US Army Engineer Major, I have been curious for some time regarding the great difficulties the Wehrmacht had with their lines of communication in Russia. For example, I know that Germany invented chainsaws prior to the war, but were they used in Russia? Why were corduroy roads, surfaced with cut logs, not used? These were used a great deal during the American Civil War in the swampy parts of the southern US. In addition, what of military construction equipment like bulldozers and excavators? Looking forward to what you have to say. Thanks." So yours is the first question of a couple, and they're all talking about logistics anyway, so I'm going to have timestamps in the video description. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer your question a bit broader than what you actually asked, and talk about logistics in general on the Axis-Soviet front. And I'm going to address a lot of the issues now in answer to this question, which will then impact my answers to the next couple of questions. So I would probably ask you all to watch this part of the video first, and then before you move on to the next bit, if that makes sense. But I'll leave the timestamps below. So we know from my previous videos that Germany didn't have much in the way of supplies of oil and rubber especially, but they did actually have a lot of coal and steel. So if you don't have rubber and you don't have fuel, oil, and you have a lot of coal and you have a lot of steel, what are you going to make? Trains. Oh boy, let's talk about trains. Yeah, oh god. Right, so Germany goes, well, building trucks is probably not a good idea. Let's build a lot of trains. Now, I'm going to quote a source here, which is one of the few books that I could actually find on the subject. Supplying War Logistics from Wallenstein to Patton, 2nd edition by Martin van Creveld, and it was written... This was actually written in 1997 originally, and then the 2nd edition, which is this one, 2004. So this is one of the earliest books on logistics talking about the Eastern Front. It only talks about Barbarossa, which is annoying because I want to see about Blau and 1943 and so on, as some of the questions will explain. So it's a little bit annoying that it doesn't fully cover everything, but it's better than nothing. And what he says is that actually in some of the earlier parts of the war, like Poland, it was actually a near-run thing. So let me give you a quote here. He said, "Given the technical conditions of 1939, you need no less than 1,600 lorries just to equal the capacity of one double-tracked railway line." So it didn't make any sense for Germany to use all these trucks because they didn't have the fuel to run them. And it made more sense to use the trains because they had the coal and the steel to use them. So what Creveld says is, while motorization was essential for operational and tactical purposes, its effects on strategy was limited. And that is absolutely true. This is why, while the bulk of the German divisions were infantry divisions, which did have 942 motor vehicles attached to each division as a means of supply, there was only a handful of actual motorized divisions. I think 16 when you get to France and 19 when you get to Barbarossa. And those infantry divisions, the vast majority of the German divisions, are relying on horse. They're relying on 1,200 horses and wagons to give them supplies. That meant that these divisions, these infantry divisions, had to stay closer or close to the railways in order to get supplies, because their wagons could only, so the trains can move a lot quicker at the station. So let's say you drop all the supplies of a logistical point at the station, then these wagons had to go back and forth a much shorter distance to the station to collect their supplies, which meant that they had to operate near the railroads. But the point is that the motorized divisions didn't operate necessarily off the railways because they had enough motorised vehicles, so that meant that they could operate along the roads. So what you have is a two-army. You've got 16 or 19 motorised and armoured divisions that operate on the roads, and you have this massive bulk infantry force that operates on the railways. And this is where there's a massive problem when you get to Barbarossa. He actually says, during the operation against Poland, destruction of railways by both sides was so heavy that the logistical system was saved from collapse only by the speedy Polish surrender, while the appalling conditions on the roads led to losses of up to 50% of the motor company's vehicles. So Poland, wasn't even a blitzkrieg campaign really. Poland, the destruction of the railways and the roads and the appalling conditions of the trucks and so on and so forth led to 50% of their supply capacity going under, and it was only saved by the fact that the Poles surrendered early. When you get to France, it's much a similar situation. They barely managed to do what they had to do, and the only reason the Germans seem to have won in France is because of their sickle cut, right? They attacked through the Ardennes, very few French divisions there, no British as far as I'm aware. They got through that and they just rode off, okay? Creveld actually says they didn't expend that much ammunition in France because they just they outmaneuvered the French and they forced them to surrender and the British to withdraw. They didn't actually have to do a lot of fighting. So it was more of a maneuver. You hear this in the sources. This is more of a maneuver than, actual fighting. And this is the reason why the logistics system was able to cope just about, not fully, but just about able to cope, because they didn't do a lot of fighting in France and then in Poland as well. But then the system doesn't work when you get to Barbarossa. So there's two authorities here. There's General Gurka, who's in charge of the railways and the water transport system. Then General Wagner, which we talked about before, who's the Quartermaster General of the OKH. He was responsible for the motor transport, and for where the supplies would be transported. So this meant that Wagner was deciding which supplies would be transported. They would then go to Gurka, who is the railway guy or the water guy, right? So Wagner chooses the supplies, Gurka then loads them onto the trains, they then go off to the front, and then Wagner, who is also the guy in charge of the motor transport, then has to deal with it the other side. So the trains are then dumping their stock and then going back, and then the stock's picked up by Wagner. So it basically meant that the transportation system and the logistics system was run by two people, one with one on both sides of and a middle guy in the middle. It's just stupid. It really is. It just, what are you doing? How is this? Why is this a thing? Why isn't one guy in charge of it? No idea. But it caused so much chaos because there was there's little cooperation between the two services on this situation. And this was in the early campaigns. When they get to Barbarossa, the situation's just as bad. It's not been resolved, and these two guys are still in charge. Now, when they look at Barbarossa, one of the generals, General Marx, looks at the road network in the Soviet Union and sees that there's only really one decent road in the south through the Ukraine towards the Caucasus. Sorry, Ukraine towards the Caucasus. This goes to Kiev. And even though this area is ideal tank country, it's flat, it's open, it's fields, great for tanks, this one road means that the Germans are kind of having to move down this one road logistically. So this is a logistical nightmare. Whereas the other guy, von Lossberg, looked at the railroads in Soviet Union and says, oh, wait a second, it's clear that the main Warsaw to Moscow railway is the best way to go, and there's also railways going north. So in actuality, it's better for the German army to go north with logistically for the infantry divisions and there's better roads in the north as well. So it's actually better if we go north, which is not what Hitler wants. Hitler was like, no, I want the Ukraine, I want the Caucasus, and we needed food and oil, right? Because this is what we're short on. So you have this discrepancy of, this contradiction of, well, the army wants to, well, the logisticians and Halder want to go towards Leningrad and Moscow, north of the Pripyat marshes, and Hitler wants to go south. But the road, or the roads and the railroads, aren't really good in the south. And this is perhaps why there was this split and why they ended up with 3 army groups rather than just, let's say one going south, and they didn't aim south. It's because the logistics didn't allow it. But even in the north, the logistics wasn't good either. So I believe, I'm not sure if it's Moscow, I think it's, the Caucasus is about 900 miles. So they have to go 900 miles into enemy territory, and they had to convert the railways from the standard European gauge to the wider Soviet gauge, which is not an easy thing to do. They also planned to not consume as much ammunition, only as much as they did in France, and because rubber tyres were in short supply, they used steel tyres, and they stopped producing rubber soles for shoes, and they only had enough reserve fuel to last them 3 months. And they couldn't use the Russian fuel because the Russian fuel was a different octave or something like that, and you had to distill it, or you had to go to an installation to get it mixed again. So they couldn't just, like they did in France, like pull up a petrol station and pour petrol into the tanks. They can't do that. And there was more motorised divisions and infantry divisions. There was more infantry divisions in general. And basically it's a disaster once the campaign begins. Now, Wagner says you can only go about 300 miles into enemy territory. They're having to go 900 miles. So this is why the Barbarossa plan was designed. Actually, we will win in the first couple of months, and then it'll just be a walk to Vladivostok or wherever the hell they're going, right? So it's like we need to win in the first few hundred miles, and if we don't, then we're screwed. And this is why the campaign was planned out like this. When you look at the advance to Leningrad, there's a unit I can't pronounce, Gross Transport Raum, a logistical unit behind the lines that was supplying, the front armies. Within the first 19 days of Operation Barbarossa, they had lost 25% of their vehicles. And that then, after another week, climbed to 33%. And they say this is because the unmetalled roads turned to mud in July, even though the weather was good. And then fuel consumption was higher because of the mud, and then it also wore out the engines. So it's like a combination of several different factors. But they did use corduroy roads. They did, but these came later because it was the case of the tanks are riding off ahead. They're going to have to build the roads, and this is where you come back. Because what happened was the panzers stuck to the roads that were actual roads and, the Russian roads, which meant that the railways weren't cleared of enemy troops. So the panzers are riding off ahead, then the follow-up infantry has to come along and deal with the troops that are behind the lines in the railway areas. And this meant that there was delays then converting the railways from the standard gauge to the Russian gauge, and that then caused delay in supplies. You also have the fact that because the Russians are using bigger trains, because they're using a bigger gauge, it means that they have fewer, what do they call them? Water stations. Yeah, water stations, where there's coal and water for the steam trains. This is a steam era, it's not electric era. So there needs to be more of those stations built, which means more manpower, so on and so forth. And the German engineers, they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it quick enough, right? And you actually see this when I'm doing Kurland, which you'll see next week, Operation Doppelkopf. What you find is that the Russians, the Soviets, are trying to take Jelgava, near Riga. Well, Jelgava, even in 1944, is a hub, right? It's where the standard European gauge meets the Russian gauge on the railway tracks. So if they take that, it massively screws up the German logistics. But the point is, in 1944, they'd only reached Jelgava. Okay, they'd been converting the railways and only reached Jelgava. Right? They were so slow in converting these railways, it's a disaster. Apparently you can't use Russian coal in the German engines unless you put German coal or petrol in it, which isn't good either. And this is why when you see Army Group North's advance or any other advance, it's stop, start, stop, start, stop, start, because the Panzers race on off ahead, they outdo the logistics, the infantry have to catch up, and then that allows them to build the railways and get that all sorted. Then they get resupplied, then they can advance again. It's a disaster. And by the time they get to Leningrad, they are so out of fuel that they can't actually advance. So even though Army Group North is probably the easiest to advance, they're next to the sea, they've got logistics coming in through the sea, they've got some of the best roads, we've just talked about that, some of the best railways in the north, and it's the shortest distance. Leningrad's closer than Moscow or Kiev or the Caucasus, right? It's closer. Leningrad is closer to the front. So this is the shortest advance, and yet they couldn't even supply three armies. Army Group North, so with 16th, 18th and 4th Panzer Armies, they haven't got enough supplies to do it and enough logistical capability to do it. So they failed. They failed to get to Leningrad, and that is the shortest distance. It's no wonder they didn't get to Moscow. There was no chance. It's no wonder they didn't get to the Caucasus. There's no chance. They were struggling, and by the time they get to Leningrad, Hitler goes, right, there's no point having a Panzer Army there if we can't supply it. Let's move 4th Panzer Army, let's move it south. And that's what happens. And that's why they don't take Leningrad. The reason was because it was a complete disaster. So in this book, he says that the conversion of the railways was a complete disaster on every level, and that's why they couldn't keep up with the advance. And then when you think of Army Group South, they faced more Soviet troops than any other army group, but also had less railways and roads to operate along, and had objectives further than the others, the Caucasus. And so, by the 19th of July, half of its lorries were out of action. Lorry companies, behind the lines. And the frontline units complained of shortages of ammunition by the end of July 1941. And the advance eventually ground to halt at 300 miles. So, as predicted, okay? And even though this was the case, Rudstedt still wanted to get to Rostov in 1941, which they did, but only just. When looking at the Stalingrad campaign, it's very much the same problem. The German units in Stalingrad, or even before Stalingrad, are going, hey, we need more fuel, we need more ammunition. Where's the ammunition coming from? Can we have ammunition, please? The 24th Panzer Division in Stalingrad's going, hey, we've run out of flak ammunition, we need more ammunition. The spare parts for tanks, just not available. Spare engines, not available. So much ammunition not available. Even for 29th, motorized division, all these divisions in Stalingrad, they're not able to get the supplies to them. So they're having to, we'll give you ammunition today of, rifle ammunition, then tomorrow you'll get the machine gun ammunition. It's a complete and utter mess when you actually look at it. And that's in 1941 and 1942. Apparently by the 8th of July, 1941, Army Group Centre could only supply 3rd Panzer Army by the railways, and 9th Army had to use motor vehicles only, which is not good. And that caused arguments. So between the two army commanders and other people. Now on the 13th of July, Wagner reassessed, he recalculated and predicted what they could and couldn't do. And he realised, we can't go further than Smolensk. And in order to get to there, they would have to halt the infantry at the Dnieper. How do you say it? Dnieper, I think it is. So when you hear of like Guderian going, oh my god, where's the infantry? That's why, because they couldn't supply them. It's robbing Peter to pay Paul. We have to say no to the infantry in order to keep the tanks going. And that's what happened. Now, bearing in mind, Wagner had already, prior to this, already decided that the troops will have to live off the land. They'll have to steal off the peasants, okay? Because we don't have enough transport to actually keep them going. So the troops are stealing off the peasants. They're living off the land. And this is why the hunger plan happened, okay? It was practical as well as, it makes sense ideologically from a Nazi point of view. Obviously not from my point of view, it doesn't make any sense, but from a Nazi point of view, it makes logical sense to not only steal the food off the people and then feed the troops, but it also makes sense to kill the people because National Socialism. So there you go. So this is another sort of, these people going, oh, the hunger plan didn't happen. It's like, well, it did. Because the logistics made it happen. It had to happen. So the Guderians of the world also say that the advance to Moscow during Operation Typhoon stopped because of the weather, which, obviously the weather did have an impact, but it's not the full picture. So let me give you a quote from Creveld, however you say his name. Close scrutiny of the quartermaster's diaries reveals what divisional histories tend to conceal, namely that the difficulties were due as much to the poor performance of the railways as the mud, since the crisis in railway transportation began well before the onset of frost. This goes some way to correct the impression that the German failure to take Moscow stemmed solely from the lateness of the season. And this actually makes sense because when the mud happens, it's like, oh, the German army slowed down. Okay then. Then why then, once it got frosty, did it not speed up again? It went at the same speed, more or less. So that weather doesn't really explain it. And what does explain it is the German logistics, the fact that it was overstretched. And he also says German locomotives did not have their water pipes built inside the boilers, so that 70 to 80% of them froze and burst. So the trains are breaking down, 70 to 80% of the trains are breaking down because of the cold, because they're not built for the Soviet weather. So this is actually why very few trains reached the front in November and December 1941, and why 4th Panzer Army received no fuel after the 17th of November. Then the Russians counterattack, the Soviets counterattack at the right time, in a sense, when the Germans are at the absolute limits of their logistical effort, where the trains are breaking down, everything else. They hammer them, they push them back, and this is where it's a case of, wait a second, they just about, because I forget who it was it Hayward or Toprani, one of them said they just about got fuel in time in the December to stave off the catastrophe that was happening with the Soviet counteroffensive. And that happens in December. There's a backlog to do with the trains, and they eventually get through, and that solves them in the December of 1941. It gives them time to fight on. So, yeah, it was actually logistics as to why they couldn't get to Moscow in 1941, not the fact that Hitler didn't allow them or sent them south or whatever. The reason he sends them south, this is the point as well, the reason he sends them south into the Ukraine, in August, is because they've outran their logistical capabilities. They couldn't go any further. So Guderian, who's complaining, well, if Hitler had just let me go to Moscow, he wouldn't have made it. He couldn't go any further. This logistical situation prevented him from going any further. So he was sent south. It's easier to go south than further away from your supply bases, because if you go south, you're just the same distance-ish, But if you go further east, you're further away. So that's actually the reason why, this argument that, Hitler should have targeted towards Moscow. No, the more troops you put into one area, the worse your logistical capabilities are going to become. So it actually doesn't make any sense that you can get to Moscow in 1941. The argument's been made that he should have just concentrated on Moscow, not gone anywhere else. He couldn't have done it because it's the distances that is going to cripple him, right? Those of you looking at it purely from a military perspective, from a purely, the Panzer Divisions could have got to Moscow perspective, Yeah, I'm certain if they were fully supplied, they could have done. But that's the point, they're not being fully supplied, so they couldn't have got any further than they actually did. The difficulties experienced in building up a base for the attack on Moscow also rule out another suggestion that is sometimes made, namely that Hitler, instead of dissipating his forces in simultaneous offensives along 3 divergent axes, ought to have concentrated them for a single attack against Moscow. The logistic situation ruled out such a solution, however, for the few roads and railroads available would not have allowed such a force to be supplied. So all these people claiming that Hitler's a madman, actually he's making a very logical decision here. Hey, we can't go any further, so I may as well use these tanks in the areas that we have got them to go south and defeat, help out Army Group South, and go north and help out Army Group North. That's why he does it. He does it purely for the logistical reasons, because he knows that he can't send the tanks further. So Hitler is actually, oh my god, Hitler's actually right. No, Hitler isn't a madman. He's using this logically. It's a logical solution to a problem. And this is why when people are accusing me and complaining of not focusing on the military aspects alone, right? Hey, you should just stick to military history. This is where it goes wrong, because their complaints are not valid. Logistics is actually economics, in a sense, right? Military requires logistics. Logistics requires economics, right? You need to know, have we got oil? Have we got food? Have we got coal? Have we got steel? Do we have logistical capability? Can we produce enough trucks? Do we have enough rubber? Blah, blah, blah. Why don't we have enough rubber? Are we trading for this stuff? Why aren't we trading for this stuff? What's the reason we're not trading for this stuff? Is there an ideological reason why we can't trade? Is there a reason why we no longer believe in trade? What is that reason? Right? Oh, wait a second, this is all related. You can't get away from the politics. You can't get away from the economics. It's all related. It's all to do with the same sort of thing. So these people who are saying, oh, by the way, you should stick to military history, it's like, no, because if I stuck to military history, I wouldn't have been able to tell you why this didn't work. I wouldn't be able to explain to you why they couldn't have gone to Moscow in 1941. This is why. Without the logistics, without the economics, without the politics that's affecting the economics, you can't have an explanation as to why this doesn't work. That's why Guderian's explanation as to why they didn't go to Moscow does not work, because he's looking at it purely from a military perspective. And it's a distortion of history to do so. It's not right to do so. So therefore, people arguing that I should stick to military history, no. And this is why. So to kind of answer Todd's actual question now, the Germans did invent chainsaws. I forget the year. I think it was in the 30s. Don't quote me on that. They invented chainsaws. Were they used in the Soviet Union? I'm not sure. The corduroy roads were. I will leave a link in the description to a US Army site that, I believe it's US Army, talks about it. It talks about the roads, and I think it's got maps that show where the roads were, at least in the north. So they were using these roads, and just an example, they say in mid-July, the entire Panzer Corps in the north bogged down, and it was only through building these corduroy roads that they actually got them going again. And apparently it's another instance in 1942. So I'll leave that link there. You can have a read. It's only a short, it's like a page. It's only a short thing, but you can have a read of that. That talks about that. And you said about bulldozers and excavators. If you can find, listen, this is literally one of the few sources that talks about logistics in World War II, especially on the Eastern Front. It doesn't even talk about 1942. It only concentrates on Barbarossa. I've looked around. There are very, very few books out there on this particular subject, and I haven't got access to the archives to look into the logistical capabilities. But I think there is a book out there on the trains, which I'm really looking forward to reading. I'm not a tank guy. I'm certainly not a train guy. And yeah, where I'd find anything about bulldozers and excavators, I'm not sure. But the corduroy roads were used, and trains were important, like very important. It's not really a full answer to your question, I'm afraid, but it's the best I can do at the minute. If I come across anything about bulldozers and excavators, I'll let you know. And then chainsaws as well. Steve has asked, have you read any of David Starhill's books? I have, and his theory seems to be that the Wehrmacht was more or less kaput by August 1941 due to poor quality vehicles and generally inadequate logistics. But the Wehrmacht was still formidable right up until 1943. What is your opinion on this theory? So, yes, I have read Starhill's, a little bit of Starhill. I've read one of his books on Barbarossa. And, yeah, again, you're saying the Wehrmacht was kaput by August 1941. And that's pretty much true. That's backed up by this source again, Supplying War. So, yeah, I absolutely agree with that. But why was the Wehrmacht still formidable up until 1943? They're at the end of their tether when it comes to logistics, but when they are armed, they're actually still okay. Now, I think the Wehrmacht, in 1941, they defeat the Soviets at the border, okay? They crush them. Then they run out of supplies and so on and so forth. Then the Soviets counterattack in the Moscow area. And this forces the Germans back a little bit. The Germans are then stuck in a position where, well, they could retreat, but that would be seen as a defeat. So they don't want to do that. And they can no longer advance on 3 axis now, like they were before. They don't have the supplies to do it. So they have this Herculean effort of, we will rob from Peter to pay Paul, we'll put all the troops in the south and send them to the Caucasus in the last-ditch attempt to win the war. Now, when you actually look at 1941 and 42, what they end up doing is, because if the statistics are correct, in 1941 the Germans don't lose that many men, and yet they seem to have lost 1 million men by the end of 1941. Like, it doesn't, like they say, oh yeah, we only lost like 300,000 men, but yet the army's 1 million men down. What's happened there? Turns out they actually sent them all back home to the factories to build the tanks and the equipment they needed for 1942. It also makes sense for logistically to go, well, actually, if we have fewer mouths to feed the further out we go, if we have smaller divisions, then we can supply these smaller divisions and lesser men, less mouths to feed. It's easier on the logistical capabilities. Oh, look, that makes sense. It's just like, oh, maybe they're converting the units to smaller divisions at this point. They concentrate them in the south in 1942. We know how, well, watch my Foul Blau video to see how that went on. But they have to kind of concentrate everything they have in the south. Then it's like a case of, well, we either send ammunition to the troops, which they desperately need, or we send reinforcements to the troops, which they desperately need. It's probably better to send ammunition first. So they send ammunition first, maybe not the reserves. And all this makes sense. Why didn't they send Manstein's 11th Army south? Why, once they took the Crimea, why didn't they send him into the Caucasus as they were planning to do? Maybe it's because they couldn't support the troops there. Then you have the Soviets counterattacking in 1942, and you get to 1943 with the Battle of Kursk, and you're saying, well, okay, they're still pretty formidable at this point. I don't know. I'm not certain about that. The Soviets tend to... They got defeated in 1941, but by 1942-43, well, the end of 1942-43, they are starting to rebuild. The only reason that the Germans are able to do so well in the early period is because they surprised, outnumbered the Soviets in day one, crushed them that way. Because you think about it this way, if you have 5 guys and the enemy has 3, you've got the advantage, right? And if they keep sending 3 men at a time, and you've got 5, you're going to win. In 1941, that's what happens. The Soviets have 3 men, they get crushed. Then they send in another 3 men, they get crushed. Yeah, oops. Overall, it's a lot of manpower. They're sending men, but they're only sending them in small groups, and as a result, they're getting crushed, right? So that 1941 period ruins the Red Army. 1942 is like a rebuild time. 1943, they're ready to go. And when they're ready to go in 1943, the Germans can't even break through the operational lines. They can't even break through into the operational depths at Kursk. And this is perhaps the reason why the Soviets have finally got into a position where they've rebuilt their army correctly. They've had the time to do that. So was it really formidable? I'm not convinced that it was. I'm really not. If you look at the 1942 Stalingrad campaign, yeah, the Germans are doing really well, but there's actually instances where they're not. I'm reading Panzerkrieg at the minute by Jason D. Mark, and he's talking about the 29th Motorized Division, specifically the 129th Panzer Battalion, and there's instances where they're fighting really hard in little tiny battles you'd never heard of. They're fighting really hard against Soviet troops, Red Army troops, outside of Stalingrad, and these Soviet troops are holding on and causing major problems for the Germans. And it's only where they have the Schwerpunkts, the concentration points, where they outnumber them on the local level, that the Germans are able to win. And this is the principle of the Schwerpunkt. You put everything you can into one area and smash through the line. Because if you concentrate 5 divisions on one division, you're going to break through, right? Because it's a concentration of force. So the reason why I think the Wehrmacht is better than the Soviets at this stage is because they're more organized, they have, better officers and blah, 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 but they actually have, because the Soviets don't have the core level, they've abandoned that. And it's just basically they've got these massive, giant armies with no organization. It's just a mess. The Germans have still got that organization, but they're using smaller and smaller forces. Well, by the time you get to 43, the whole thing's not working out so well. They're no longer able to break through the operational depths. They can't supply their troops properly. It's just this is it's a very complicated question, or an answer to the question, but effectively, yeah. It doesn't make sense to me. They're not really that formidable. Even 1942 and 43, in my opinion, they're not as good as they often made out to be. The reason they do so well is purely because their enemy has been defeated earlier on and is trying to rebuild. And once they do rebuild, it's like, oh, Blitzkrieg suddenly lost its magic. Why is that? All right, so that is kind of my thing there. That's my theory on it.
And Robert has asked, "Hey TIK, I enjoy how much emphasis you place on the importance of logistics with respect to strategy. With that emphasis, how detrimental to the Axis/German supply/logistics chain were acts of sabotage committed by slave/forced labour, or were the effects of sabotage relatively ineffective to the overall logistic chain?"
So I've looked, and I'm not certain where I can get information to answer this specifically, because I know that the slave forces and the labourers, they were taken from the east and shipped back to the Reich, and there were volunteers helping out with the logistical situation, but was there any sabotage in that sort of thing? I don't know. I honestly don't. I don't even know where to begin. This book doesn't mention it. I'm struggling to find any sources on logistics at all, let alone specific to this, answering this question. There were security divisions behind the front, and there were volunteer units like the police, the Latvian police, for example, Lithuanian police, Ukrainian police. These guys helped out. And there were partisans behind the lines doing damage behind the lines, but really that only got going from late 1943 onwards. Before that, it wasn't really an issue, as I've talked about in a previous video. So it's hard to say specifically, really, before 1943, how much an impact the slave and forced labourers had on the logistics. I would probably say not necessarily on the logistics chain itself. I would probably say more likely on the Reich itself. If they got shipped back to the factories, did they do any damage in the factories? That's something that I can look into, I guess, probably. But I probably have to do that with the Holocaust. But yeah, I would probably say probably not as much. I don't think the slave and forced labourers did much. The partisans did, but only in 1943 onwards, because before that they were an unorganised mess. And from what I can tell, I think the major problems with the logistical issues with the Germans was probably not sabotage, but actually just the fact that they sucked at it. Like that, their machines, their trains were breaking down, their tanks were breaking down, their trucks were breaking down, that sort of stuff, and just the distances. That's what's more important. Sure, there'll be the odd sabotage, but I reckon the major issues was just the distances involved and the fact they were unprepared for it. So, a bit of an iffy answer to that one, but I hope overall this video has been useful to some people. So yeah, I hope that answers the questions overall. I think I'm struggling just for a lack of sources on, the logistics side of it. If anyone's got any suggestions of books that do talk about logistics, let me know and I can get them, because as I say, there's very few books out there that actually talk about this. The most are talking about the military side, and then it's a case of, well, we're not getting our answers quite, we're not seeing the full perspective here. We need more on the logistical side. So yeah, if you've got any suggestions for books, let me know. Thank you to my patrons for supporting me. Thank you to my subscribe-starians for supporting me, and patrons. Gotta get used to this. My patrons. You guys have made this video possible, as you are making every video possible on mine. So thank you very much for that. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Oh, and a bit of a postscript. I will have a video out tomorrow discussing another topic. Not too in-depth, but it'll be there. So see you tomorrow. Bye for now.